Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Monique Cornish tuku ingoa. Welcome wherever you are across the motu today to our third Climate Action webinar series. Let me first introduce myself as the co-chair of the Sustainability Society for this year. TSS, or the Sustainability Society, is a group at Engineering New Zealand, and I guess supports both Engineering New Zealand and our membership to lead on climate action. We do that through broadly three ways. The first being exactly what we're doing today, which is education and knowledge sharing. We also influence policy and do that independently as well as with Engineering New Zealand. And last but by no means least, build a community of practice. And wherever you are, or I shouldn't say wherever, if you're with us here in Tamaki Makaurau, down in Wellington or beautiful Christchurch, you can join us every month for green drinks in an informal setting to join that community of practice. My thanks particularly to Holly and the rest of Engineering New Zealand for supporting us in developing and delivering this series, and today's being the third and final in that series. The package of sessions, again with today being the last, were actually not developed, or they were developed by us, but they were instigated by ENZ branches. The request came through to us, goodness, almost a year ago, to help branches understand how they and how engineers, as part of those branches, can become climate leaders. And we put our heads together and formed this series that you're participating in today. And I know some of you are joining us for the first time, but some of you have been with us across the entire 6 weeks of the program. We initially kicked off with talking about mitigation and looking at the policy context and some of the tools that you can use at the corporate level to make a 1.5 degree commitment. We then, 3 weeks ago, with the support of colleagues from Tonkin and Taylor, looked at adaptation risk, including the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, and some of the tools that are being used around the country to begin to adapt. The adaptation action part being incredibly important to move from understanding risk to adaptation. And today, we have our conversation about transitional risk. And this is, I was going to say emerging, not quite true. It's a less well discussed and possibly a less well understood aspect of climate action. And I'm joined today by two wonderful colleagues who are going to help, first of all, really define what transitional risk and opportunity is. And if you were with us in the first session, you'll recall that I mentioned the Task Force for Climate Related Disclosures as I was going through that broader sustainability context. So we're going to get into what TCFD actually is and how it can help today. We'll be following up with mandatory disclosure. Jack Bissett from XRB is joining us to talk about Aotearoa's policy response to disclosure. And then Christoph is going to join us with some more case studies around how mandatory disclosure and thinking about transitional risk are actually changing business practices. We're going to allow plenty of time for questions, actually a really in-depth Q&A session. So please, if you do have questions as we go through the presentations, please put them into the chat and I'll pick as many as I can up as we get into the Q&A at the back end of the session. So I've done a little bit of the context of this series, but let me just remind you of our why we need climate action. This is the big why. Regardless of mitigation or how successful our mitigation efforts are, our global climate is changing. And in New Zealand, that's going to bring a host of challenges through increased temperatures, more extreme weather events and changing rainfall patterns, which will potentially impact our electricity supply, as well as our horticulture and agriculture, dependent on water. And yes, even here in Aotearoa, we can expect to get more wildfires, to the point they really do become a risk. Now, the trajectory of impact is commensurate to the trajectory of carbon emissions. So the more we bring down our carbon emissions, the mitigation side of things, the less the impacts will be. But the impacts are still going to be with us, which is why we need to begin not just a conversation, but planning to adapt. I'll remind you once again that as engineers, we all have a part to play in both adaptation and mitigation. When you look at the wheel on the left that breaks down our total greenhouse gas emissions by sector, I challenge you, if you can't see your work, your practice, your sector on this wheel, let me know in the chat and I will find it for you. Whether you're designing building ventilation systems, working in the civil space, ground improvement, or have maybe stepped out of traditional engineering practice into management, you have a place on this wheel and therefore are really important part to play in driving our emissions down. When we think about adaptation, I've put some really physical examples here: coastal inundation, droughts, increased temperatures that impact our built environment and our way of doing business. And it's the way of doing business that I'd welcome you to turn your minds to now. When we talk about transitional risk, or transitional risk and opportunity, it's that combination of reducing emissions and how that changes our activities, and how the physical environment is changing and how that needs to change our activities. So really in this conversation today, we're bringing both parts of this, both sides of this coin together. Now, I mentioned opportunity. There is opportunity in this space, whether it's the market advantage of offering a low carbon solution or the competitive advantage of offering physical resilience solutions. Both of those are there, but the real secret sauce for our economy may well be in the space in the middle, which is transitional risk and opportunity. Now, I know I'm starting to step onto what my wonderful colleague Christoph is going to share with you. So I will stop there, but as he shares the technical insights of transitional risk and opportunity and TCFD, Task Force for Climate Related Disclosures, I'll challenge you to think through how you would implement that in your business or on your projects. Now, let me introduce you to Christoph. Christoph Brouillard is a principal consultant at Point Advisory, a boutique sustainability services provider with offices across Australia and a small presence here in Aotearoa. Christoph has an amazing professional background, but specialises in understanding and articulating financial value and non-financial value, and helping businesses integrate that into their business models. As part of that work, TCFD is just the tip of the iceberg for Christoph, but as part of that work, he's become one of ANZ's leading experts on TCFD. So he's going to share two components of our conversation today. Firstly, some of the technical detail, and then some case studies to help you, again, begin to think through how transitional risk and potentially a formal disclosure might benefit your business and your engineering practice. Christoph, please feel free to say a little bit more about Point if you'd like, but I'll hand over to you now with my thanks. Kia ora. And I'll get you to come off mute if you can, Christoph. Oh, you seem to be stuck on mute. There we go.
Thank you. I wasn't allowed to I'm allowed to present, but not to unmute myself. Monique, that's
Ah,
typical you keeping control.
and if you'd like to take control, I will certainly approve it for the slides, or I can move them forward for you if that's
No,
easier.
I've got the control over the slides.
You've got it.
I just
Marvelous.
couldn't unmute myself. So anyway, good morning. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So Monique, thanks a lot for your glowing introduction. I'm not sure I deserve that, but look, I do my best to impart a little bit of the kind of knowledge that I've gained over the last few years working on TCFD. My background is in economics, as Monique hinted, and I've come to climate change probably in the last 15 years, and to sustainability in the last 20 years when I moved to Australia from France. And my background prior to that was in financial risks. So that makes me quite old, as you guess, but that kind of varied background allows me to really reflect on what it is that we're trying to achieve in this world by having functioning economy and really importantly using mechanisms that are economic mechanisms to effect change. So Monique asked me to give you a perspective on the corporate perspective on the transition risks and seen through the lens of TCFD. So to start, I am trying to move Monique, but I'm not sure I can. Okay. Did I do that or did you? I'm not sure. Anyway, every presentation on climate change always starts with inspirational quotes and bushfire pictures. So I've done that, tick. But basically, what I wanted to mention here, I won't repeat those quotes, but we're shifting, like what TCFD is doing, and what we've seen in the last few years is shifting the debate from like, is climate change really happening? How scary it is, and is that really bad? And can we get away with like doing things as usual and just doing things just making sure that we're prepared for the worst catastrophes. So that was very much kind of 10-15 years ago, to thinking, well, if everyone is acting like it's happening and the world is changing and so on, then it is really happening, and we don't, like, it's that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If the economy is shifting to adapt to a low carbon world, then as a corporate, I need to see what the consequences are and what they for my activity, and I need to do what I need to do. And Mike Carney, the quote at the bottom is very much expressing that kind of shifting mentality, like, oh, someone will do it, it's really important, but someone will do it, it's the government that needs to do it. No one is taking care of it, so as a corporate, I need to actually do my bit. And then the other important thing is to mention the value chains. So companies and all of us, we are economically linked by those value chains. We are consumers, we're expressing preferences, we are creating the economic impetus that means that economy is functioning. So we've got choices to make, and those choices inform corporates and their strategies. And then corporates also are linked to other corporates through value chains. Typically you can think of energy. Corporates are big buyers of energy, which are a sector that is contributing to climate change immensely. So they can affect change through also their value chains. And if everyone expresses those kind of concerns and those preferences through their buying preferences, then the world will slowly transition, or hopefully quickly, I should say, transition to quite a different type of paradigm of emissions. Then, I guess at the core of this system too, there are investors. And TCFD has very much been created for investors. And investors have realized probably in the last 5 years only I've seen that happening, that you cannot really free ride for either. And hence they have started to try and identify which sectors are trying to free ride still. And within sectors, specific companies increasingly. And who might be the losers and the winners in tomorrow's world, to effectively anticipate on that and just change their investment portfolios accordingly. And that's extremely powerful because obviously without financing, there is no economic activity. So when you wrap all this together, it's no longer a question of when, but how, by which mechanism and how quickly the world will transition. I guess, you know, when I was writing this, I was thinking, but yeah, all that is also very often pictured as a risk or a negative thing, but it is a good thing. It is actually triggering innovation. It's drawing on what humans do best, you know, adapt, change, and create, you know, hopefully a better world. So, just wanted to briefly talk about the external pressures on corporate. I say briefly because, well, you can read all that. There are just some examples of what's happening, but basically, who is on board with this agenda? The regulators are coming on board. They were not the first movers, you know. TCFD and was born after the Paris COP25 in 2015, and it's a voluntary initiative to start with. It's you know, an initiative by Bloomberg and McCartney, the former head of the Bank of England, but he was not longer acting as a regulator. He was really acting as effectively part of the mover and shaker in the corporate world, but trying to leverage voluntary action. Stakeholder expectations are shifting. Obviously, that's very powerful too, and that's through the value chains that I was talking about, but also through shareholder activism. So we see more and more. You've got a few examples there, but we see more and more the shareholders asking for more resolute action on climate change, and it's for financial reasons. It's to preserve the value of their investments in the future. I mean, they can use legal means, they can use simple pressure, you know, naming, shaming, and what have you. And that's all part of like this increasing scrutiny. So TCFD is very much at the core of that, because TCFD is a framework for more transparency, for better disclosure, more consistent disclosure. So setting some standards, if you like, around what is being communicated to the market to allow this increased scrutiny. And I was mentioning before the finance sector, so that investors, that's pension funds, banks, but also, of course, insurers, represent effectively the blood that is flowing for the economy, the money, right? And they're making decisions based on the long-term interests of their own investors. And that has been very, very powerful in affecting change. And then, you know, obviously everyone is learning in the process. And so it's a process of continuous improvement. So we set some principles to start with. You start doing things, you know, fairly clumsily to start with. And then as time goes on, there's a refinement that is happening in the rules and the expectations themselves. So I wanted to before I go into TCFD proper, just very quickly remind everyone that where that kind of like transition is coming from. It's really very much linked to the carbon budget that is remaining. So just remind everyone that we're not trying to stop global warming completely. We're simply trying to reduce the impacts at the high end of the spectrum and the catastrophe spectrum. So it is also very important to remember that we actually don't know what could happen if we went to the high end. We're not even fully sure what's going to happen, even if we limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And in the bar chart on the right-hand side, you see that scarily, so we are already at 1.1 degrees of warming accumulated through the accumulation of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. We only have 7 years worth of, today's kind of like projections of emissions in the world to have a chance to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And then another 25 years worth if we want to limit to 2 degrees. And 2 degrees, as I said, is far from ideal in terms of outcome. And 1.5 is very unlikely at this stage, obviously, because we only have seven years, and the COP26 has not actually reached an agreement that makes us confident that this is achievable. So basically, this remaining budget is key in terms of creating a systems of accountability, because each company, each country, of course, but also each company, global or small, can calculate what part of this carbon budget they are responsible for. So when we talk about net zero targets, it's always linked to this carbon budget and how quickly you can get there. And of course, that begs the question: whose effort is required? And of this slide, just wanted to position different sectors to say that different sectors have different contribution to greenhouse gas, of course, but also different abilities to contribute to emission reduction. Simple example is like tomorrow, if you wanted, like you're all engineers, I'm sure you know that their solutions exist. And tomorrow, if you wanted to decarbonize the energy sector fully, you could. It's just a question of investing heavily enough. But the technology is there, so that there's an enormous potential to reduce in that sector. In agriculture, agriculture is also increasingly under scrutiny, but for a long time, and you know that in New Zealand, there was questions of like, can you stop the sheep from emitting methane? No, so there should be cut some slack, and we should do more effort in other sectors and so on. And while it's remaining, there is still a very high pressure on sectors like agriculture to actually figure out how they're going to contribute to emission reduction. The building sector, which might be quite relevant to some of you, the building sector is also an interesting one, because there's this kind of two contributions: the contribution of construction, like all the materials, the embodied carbon, and the construction process emits a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and that dwarfs. Usually it was dwarfed by, especially for buildings themselves, by your partial energy. But as the energy sector decarbonizes, then there is more and more scrutiny put on the construction process, the sourcing of material, and closing the loop in that way, and looking at the life cycle, the full life cycle of the building, from sourcing the material to construction all the way to demolition at the end. So after that, let's see. I'm just trying to keep tab on the time I'm spending. Monique, tell me if I'm being too lengthy here. I just wanted to introduce now the TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. There's lots of interesting words in that. So it's a task force. It is voluntary, as I was saying to start with. But interestingly, it's very quickly, because only since 2017, this voluntary is starting to shift. New Zealand is a shining example of jurisdiction that is adopting the principles of TCFD and making it effectively mandatory for your financial sector to start with. It's designed to allow companies and organizations to, as I was saying at the start, more consistently disclose on climate-related risks, so that investors can rely on those disclosures to actually understand and make comparisons between different companies within sectors and across the sectors. It's not all kind of risk oriented. It's also looking at the opportunities. So a transition to a low carbon world involves not only moving away from the polluters, if you like, the emission intensive industries, but also making a concerted effort to invest in those industries of the future. And those industries of the future are the ones that are bringing the opportunities. So they're very much these two aspects, and especially when it comes to the transition side of TCFD. So I should hasten to say that TCFD is dealing with both the physical risk of climate change and what we call the transition risks of climate change, and is looking at both the opportunities and the risks. But opportunities arise from the transition. There are very few opportunities that arise from adaptation. It doesn't mean that there are none, but it's it's mostly on the transition side that you see those opportunities arising. Over time, and that's the bottom part of this chart that you have there, over time, the objective is to actually quantify in financial terms those risks and opportunities and disclose that in your annual account. So it's really important because the CFO becomes responsible for those disclosures, and hence someone who's responsible for the financial health of the company has got a clear responsibility to address those questions which have been left to sustainability officials for too long. I like TCFD because it's a very comprehensive framework. It's a flexible framework. It has got exactly the right level of guidance and flexibility. Although, as I said, as time goes by, rules will likely to I guess become more and more precise for different sectors. And I guess the last thing I wanted to mention there on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got the 4 pillars of TCFD, and that makes it really powerful. You've got the governance side of things, so how an organization effectively makes decisions around climate-related risks and opportunities. You've got the strategy that's super important because it's, as I said, it's no longer a question of sustainability, doing what we can. It's a question of survival, of business survival in the long term, and looking how your strategy needs to be adapted to withstand that change. And we've got many examples of that happening with the energy companies, and I mentioned Royal Shell before on the slide. These companies have to fundamentally change their strategy to demonstrate that they can survive in a different world. There's a question of risk management. That's more the integration of the climate-related risk identification in the risk management processes. And then the metrics and targets, which everyone is probably more familiar with, which is to do on the, I guess, the transition side, a lot to do with the carbon intensity of your activities across the whole value chain, which, this year, for example, we've seen a very big push for Scope 3 emissions to be calculated and disclosed. Trying to get to the next slide. I don't know, it's not moving for me. Okay. So the TCFD is giving guidance to identify those risks and opportunities. I've circled the transition side of things. Like I must stress again that TCFD is a very well balanced framework that looking at both the physical side of things and the transitional side of things. So transition is defined as the risks and opportunities associated with that transition to a low carbon global economy. And to make things and to break things down and to make the analysis more easy, TCFD is giving those pointers around policy and regulation. What should you consider? Well, carbon price obviously is one important one if it comes to that, but also the emissions reporting obligations and also the disclosure obligations that are coming into force in some jurisdictions. Technology has an essential role to play. Australia, the current government seems to think that with technology is going to save us from everything. So, but apart from that, it is true that the change in technology is always creating disruptions and opportunities and risks for different companies. Opportunities for those that and invest in the right technologies, and risks for those that are maybe leaving it until too late or cannot afford to modernize and invest in technology. Markets, so that's the changing customers' demand, potentially also increasing cost of raw materials. Like we knew, for example, we thought that solar panels were going to become cheaper and cheaper forever. I don't know what's happening in New Zealand, but in Australia at the moment, we're finding that the supply chain issues and the concentration of the supply chain too are creating some supply bottlenecks. So there are interesting dynamics there. And then, of course, reputation, and that reputation is very much playing out in the broader world, but also in the shareholder advocacy space. So that's a nice framework to examine the risks. And I should have said also there are different institutions that have interpreted this guidance sector by sector. So there's plenty of examples, there's plenty of good practices, and there's plenty of guidance around. It remains a tricky thing to do. And I guess for this slide, I just wanted to illustrate very briefly that had you actually try to grapple with what the potential transition will look like, or how do you understand the potential futures? So scenarios for the future are really powerful element, and it's recommended to use that under the CFD. And on this diagram, I just position a few things and how we go about that typically as a consultant, but obviously companies can do that on their own. And I think the important message there is like climate change doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the context of mega trends that are not solely climate related, and then the business drivers specific to each industry need to be taken into account and examined in the context of reference climate models that are actually causing not, the models are not causing anything, but are reflecting on the changing climate. And that's how you kind of define different possible future that helps you hopefully identify those risks and opportunities that you're facing as a corporate. So just to conclude and recap, basically, just wanted to stress that this is all, first of all, it is not that scary because it is a world of opportunity. And it is a question of like, it is one opportunity to really reflect on a business model and say, okay, where should I take this as a corporate? What's my what's the grand plan here to adapt to a different world? And very often, and I guess my clients, our clients, are actually looking towards consultants for technical solutions or technical analysis that is going to give them the only possible answer. And I just wanted to put decision making back into the center of this, and the corporate governance aspect of it. There's no simple or unique answer to whatever you're going to uncover through the background work done by TCFD. And at the end of the day, it's not something that's happening on the side, but thinking that you can only tweak this and that, or source renewable energy and you're done, is naive at best. And really, what decision makers need to think through is how they're going to actually make those decisions, justify those decisions, stand by the decision when they facing their stakeholders. And that's very much enough for me. Sorry, I went over a little bit, but I look forward to hearing your questions later on.
Oh, kia ora, Christoph. Thank you. A good reminder for people to pop any questions that are coming to mind for them into the chat for us to address in the Q&A. And thank you, Christoph, for taking us through, I guess, the TCFD approach at a macro level, but I think your last point of bringing decision making back into this, the fix is certainly not just technology or tools, and it's really important. For those of you who were on our first session might recall the component that we had on decision making and having that conversation with our clients about beginning to change. So really good connection. Now, there's another really important connection here that I want to make for you and introduce you to Jack Bissett, who is the policy manager in the climate response team at the XRB, the External Reporting Board. Jack has a broad background, macroeconomics as well, my two economists, but also emissions trading, sustainable finance, and now climate related disclosures. And most importantly, has been leading or co-leading, I think, the work that the XRB have been doing on developing a climate disclosure standard for New Zealand. You'll recall that the consultation on this commenced around the time of our second webinar. So we have made reference to this work, but I think this is a really important chance for us to understand both legal disclosure requirements and what the XRB is going to have in place to help guide and support that. So moving from that broad global context down to a little bit more local. And both Jack and Christoph have some case studies to share. So we will contextualize the process and the New Zealand requirements for you in the final part of our session. With no more ado, Jack, I can see you're off mute, and I hope that you have control of the screen, of the slides. I will hand over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thanks, Monique. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Jack Bissett. I'm a policy manager at the External Reporting Board. Thanks for the introduction, Monique. So I'm going to run through a quick intro about who the External Reporting Board even is, maybe a new organisation for many, and then I'll do a little bit of a update on where we're at developing climate disclosure standards in New Zealand, and a little bit as well later on around scenario analysis in particular, and what we're doing in that space, which is quite interesting and exciting. So I will get into it. Hopefully I've got, yes, that works. Oh, I've got animations and everything, so it's going to be lots of fun. So yeah, the External Reporting Board's vision is New Zealand prospering through effective decision making. So the focus really is around information and ensuring that decision makers have access to the information that they need to make informed decisions. So we're an independent Crown entity that's responsible for developing and implementing accounting, audit and assurance standards for New Zealand, and climate disclosure is the new kid on the block in that context, you know, effectively moving from, as Christoph outlined, a voluntary disclosure framework developed by this task force, for the purposes of better information, and now that's moving now in New Zealand and in other countries, including the UK and many others, and then also via the International Sustainability Standards Board into the world of accounting standards, which will admit is new to me and is going to be new to many. So it's a real meeting of the worlds in terms of climate policy and accounting, but also plenty of other disciplines around the table too. So it's definitely an exciting space. So yeah, effectively, the reason that we're here is so this is what I'll cover. I think I've mentioned that already. So the reason that we're here is this amendment, which was an amendment to basically two pieces of legislation, and which is now an act. So the Financial Markets Conduct Act and the Financial Reporting Act, and also the Public Audit Act, I shouldn't forget. So effectively, that act is now law. That was passed just recently, and that effectively empowers the External Reporting Board to create these standards. And yeah, the whole intention around the bill is to really, as Christoph says, mainstream and systematize this kind of information coming through in the financial markets and through with the large corporates, so that we can really all start to make, and all of the decision makers in these entities can start to make decisions that are effectively more aware of risks and opportunities in the way that the world is rapidly moving already, in response to climate change in its various forms. So effectively, the bill went through October 2021, so that gives us a bit of a forward-looking plan that looks a bit like this, which is that we're intending to consult over the course of the next year, and then publish a fully finalised set of climate disclosure standards in December 2022, and then everything effectively kicks off on a formal mandatory basis effectively from January 2023, and then a few bits and bobs to follow in terms of finalised deadlines for reporting, and then assurance kicks in a little bit later on. So just zooming in a little bit on the next year of that, so we're effectively just consulted on the first half of our standard, which focused on effectively two pillars of the TCFD framework: governance and risk management. And then we're consulting in March 2022 on strategy and metrics and targets. And strategy we see is really an important part of the overall framework, and that's where scenario analysis comes in, which is one of the areas we're doing a lot of work on at the moment. And then we'll do a final full exposure draft in July, and then publish the framework in December. So who's captured by this mandatory regime? In New Zealand at least, so that's the large listed issuers. So that's effectively the corporates on the NZX in New Zealand who are over a certain size threshold, which down the bottom there has for the listed issuers is market capitalization over 60 million, and then we have a range of financial institutions also captured by the bill, or now the Act, which applies to those entity types there, and they come in on the basis that they have over $1 billion of assets under management. So that's the who, but we're certainly getting lots of feedback at the moment that in New Zealand, many entities who are not in scope of this are increasingly deciding that it's a good idea for them to do anyway. They want to get ahead of effectively investor pressure. They think it's just the direction of travel, the right thing to do. And so there's actually quite a lot who are in that bucket of not necessarily in scope, but kicking things off right about now and getting their hands dirty with this stuff. And the government has decided, I believe, Cabinet has decided that they will be consulting soon on expanding their regime to more entity types. And I think that it's just a matter of whether that happens in 2022 or 2023. So everyone expecting these things to continue to expand in the sense of it being a mandatory disclosure regime. Here's our perspective on effectively the sectors that we're talking about. So there's quite an important distinction between the financial institutions and the non-financial, because they they see the world a bit differently when they look out the window. So we have the financials on the left, and then a range of non-financial institutions on the right, and yeah, obviously loads of those sectors there, very relevant for all of you, and particularly the energy, materials and buildings, but yeah, hard to go past agriculture and transport in this country as well. And then that does leave a range of smaller sectors that we also have in scope where it's not as many entities captured, so across retail, hospitality, information, media and telecoms, healthcare, education and HR and government. So that's effectively everyone. So what I'm going to kick into next is effectively where we're at is we are developing the standards and the requirements around scenario analysis. So the TCFD recommends that entities undertake scenario analysis, and that it's really an important part of the overall regime, but it is quite difficult to do. And so what we're trying to do at the moment in order to encourage individual entities who are caught by this regime, but effectively more broadly, a whole range of other entities as well, is that sectors come together to construct climate-related scenarios, at a sectoral level, so that, as Christoph has said, some of this information, and this detail around what are the risks and opportunities actually look like for me, say in the materials and building space, that can be very different to how it looks in the agriculture space. And so we're seeing, an important role in the overall regime for some collaboration at sector levels, which I think can be exciting for various sectors. And we're effectively in the process at the moment of going and talking to each of these sectors in that sort of order you just saw, and really communicating that that's our expectation, that that we think this should happen. And the next couple of slides are a little bit about why that is. So effectively, there's a lot of discussion in this space about reference scenarios and scenarios that are being produced by organizations like the IPCC, and we kind of are trying to communicate those as a lot of this is quite global information, about the way that the biosphere is changing with this top level climate warming, through to how's the global GDP picture and demographics changing, socioeconomic changes around what's happening in the economies and societies of not just New Zealand, but all countries around the world. Some really potentially major changes that look like they're going to take place around, the equator effectively, due to range of climate drivers and impacts. But a lot of this is quite meta, it's really quite high level stuff for a individual entity down in New Zealand, so down in that table below, to really take a lot of that information, turn it into the types of scenarios that they can use to inform their strategy, whether it's really a useful thought exercise around, here is some structured thinking about what potential futures look like that we can be confident in are plausible, and that challenge us in terms of our assumptions about the way that things are looking, that we can usefully use in the strategy and corporate decision making. So there's a bit of a gap in where that question mark is around that translation exercise, and that's where we think that this idea of sectoral scenarios can really play an important role to fill the gap a wee bit, where you can come together as a sector, take that top level, 3 or 4 bars there, and really condense them into sensible scenarios that play out at the sectoral scale in New Zealand or in Australia. There's many examples of this now, and this is increasingly something that's happening quite a fair bit. So we also think that it can reduce costs and the resourcing needs compared to the world where individual entities have to do that job themselves, and can be quite a search, can be quite a head scratcher for those not particularly used to this space. So I think we're arguing that if you, as entities, collaborate and effectively get some experts in the room early on, this can really take a lot of the lifting out of what can quite easily happen, which is lots of head scratching and running around. So I have an example to walk through next around how that's happened in New Zealand already. Do you want me to run through that now, Monique, or I can keep that up my sleeve until after Christoph?
No, go for it, Jack.
Keep going. Okay, great. So yeah, so we have this example in New Zealand of the marine sector who's come together and done this back in 2020. So we, in addition to the marine sector, we're aware that the insurance sector in New Zealand's kicking off a process to do the same thing, I believe, starting tomorrow. Then there are, there's a lot of interest and discussion going on at the banking level. We know in Australia, there's quite a lot of new developments with the banks. They're collaborating to do this. And effectively, what I'm going to run through now is a few slides about, well, how does it actually look in practice? Because it can seem a little bit nebulous. So these are effectively the two scenarios that the marine sector ended up creating. And these are, reflected here in one page. But, this is largely this two quite divergent worlds, and they are trying to really, work out at the level of the extremes so that they really highlight where the risks and opportunities are, rather than being things that are closer to the middle of the road because, which is closer to a prediction or what we hope is going to happen. The purpose of these scenarios is to really reveal risk and opportunity and to really be challenging to entities. So, that's why you see it being a 4-degree type and high physical risk Marco transition on the left there. Scenario on the left there, where that's not going to look good at all from a physical impacts on New Zealand. And this is in the marine sector, large impacts on the fisheries, quite potentially disastrous impacts for fisheries in New Zealand. And Kahawai is effectively the world with rapid transition, where there's potentially going to be some disruption to the fisheries sector in New Zealand with really rapid change in consumer preference and consumer demand for sustainably caught fish, which will impact them in various ways as well. So those are the two. And I think since this was even done, which was 2020, the world's moved on a lot already since then. There's probably been a few things change. One is that, there's more agreement now that good practice looks more like 3 to 4 scenarios at a minimum rather than 2, which we're having regard for when we're setting standards around this stuff. Plus, 4 degrees is increasingly seen as, outside the realms of at least what's useful to do to test the resilience of strategy, because it, effectively you could get beyond the point of really worrying about the fisheries sector, and you should probably be a bit more worried about, the state of society. So this is what the process looked like, and I think this is one thing that's important in this space around scenario analysis, is that can often be thought about as plugging in a model or ringing up the experts to tell you what's going to happen in the future. But really it's a process for structured thinking where entities can really get a lot of value out of it. And, the more collaborative and the more people and perspectives that get involved, the more useful and the more value that everyone tends to get out of it. So this sort of 1, 2, 3 over the top is effectively the guidance from the Task Force on Climate-related Disclosures in terms of what's the process that could be followed to do scenario analysis. So effectively the first stage is engage your stakeholders. So in this marine example, they got together the commercial sector, a lot of iwi, fisheries organisations, policymakers, science providers and NGOs to come together and effectively agree to be part of this process. And then they chose a focal question, and effectively for this purpose, the focal question tends to be how climate-related risks and opportunities are likely to play out. And the important point there is at the sector level and getting that sector definition working right, so that everyone who's in the room is going to benefit from it. But if you happen to be, from the aquaculture and, you're the only one in the room who's interested, then, you might see that there's need to cut it differently in terms of what sectors are being considered. And then the next one is to identify and rank driving forces. And these are, some of these terms have specific meanings from the sort of futures and scenario literature and space. And so this is what the TCFDs effectively picked up is, these idea of driving forces, which are, it's quite a broad view of, effectively what are the key things that are changing that you're uncertain about, but which could have a big impact on your entity and your sector. So as you'll see with those boxes, quite a very broad perspective on what's changing. And then the next part of the process is effectively drafting scenario narratives, and that's That's something that's also very important, which is, effectively stories that you're telling which are consistent with the assumptions in those scenarios and consistent with the science, the economics, as well as these things can be brought together in a sensible way. And then you really have to craft scenario narratives that make sense, so for New Zealand, for example, a lot of the narrative work and a lot of the story in there is around the Treaty of Waitangi, iwi Māori considerations, quite localized issues, and that really colors and enables it to come to life a bit more, so that it's something that you can really war game and really walk through as an entity, and bring it to life, so it's a really important part of the process. And then there's a bit of a check, which is to say, look, now that we've done this work, is it coherent? Is it plausible? Is it challenging? And is this actually useful for decision making? And if everyone involved in the process is going, this is crazy, this is never going to happen, there's certainly a bit of to and fro that goes on in these collaborations, but unless it's seen as plausible, and unless there's buy-in to the fact that these things are coherent worlds, then they're not going to go far in terms of being decision useful. So I think that that's where well-structured and well-facilitated collaborations can really become important. And then lastly, and this is probably starting to move back down to the level of the individual entity, is developing options for what you're going to do about it, and identifying basically metrics to monitor progress. So that was my presentation. Yeah, so I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks, Monique, and everybody for yes, basically getting the update, and we really encourage you all to engage with us on the journey. So we're next cab off the rank is consultation on strategy metrics and targets in March. So please do keep an eye out for that, and reach out to us at any stage to engage with us on our process. We're really busy, but we're having a lot of fun getting lots of useful input. So would value everyone's input as well.
Kia ora, thanks, Jack. I would tautoko the importance of staying connected to the work that the XRB are doing in this space. And I know I've got a few questions about sector scenario development, and perhaps what to do if you're not working in one of the sectors where that work is being undertaken, that I'll save up for the Q&A. A reminder to everyone that if you have questions coming to mind for you, please do pop them in the chat so that we can address them in the Q&A. I'm going to hand over back to you, Christoph, if you're able to take control back from Holly. Perfect. To share a few more case studies to I guess both illustrate the theoretical information that you've both presented and show how at the entity level, at the business level, this work is being progressed. So over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so just thought we would show you or talk about a case study. Really, I've got a few case studies if we want to go through different ones, but I think I might just elaborate on that one, which is for an insurance company, which I chose not to name, but we've done some work supporting their identification of transition risk, especially. And the reason was that it's an insurance company, they play different roles. The one that you're all most familiar with is really insuring against physical risks, but they also insure against business risks. And they felt that they had done a fair bit of work on finding out and understanding what the physical risks are for their customers. And there's a probabilistic approach, and it's fairly well understood from their perspective. But they on the other side of the equation, on the transition risk, they felt that they needed to do, to start doing work a couple of years back. So they asked us to effectively design a process that would be very much a kind of an internal learning process. So workshop-based, knowledge sharing based, so that their people who know the business could grasp those type of scenarios, future scenarios that Jack was talking about, and put them in the context of the activities that they were responsible for, the different people and different units within this insurance company, and see whether they could come up with novel and interesting ideas of where the business might be at risk of losing momentum, or where there could be opportunities to develop new activities and or products. So basically what, like in terms of a few words on the process, was they decided to focus on 3 industries in energy, transportation, and heavy material, due to effectively the intensity of those industries. They convened they asked for some experts to come and talk. There was a very different range of experts. There were people who were very real futurists, for example, in transport sector. They got someone who was really talking about, the use of drones, like a really kind of outside the box, not just hydrogen trucks, but, just that kind of more, a broader view on what the future of transport, both for freight and individual transport, might be. Heavy materials was an interesting one because of the embodied energy and the challenge, the technological challenge there that might entail. So energy was probably the most kind of expected and straightforward, but I think for non-technical specialists there was a lot there to understand. And I guess, what did they get out of that? And what did we get out of that is, first of all, for me, it was like realization that there are many roles that are being played by an insurance company. They are investors, because all the effectively they have to have very big reserves, as you can imagine, to be able to pay for damages when and if they occur. So they accumulate money over a long period of time, and they will have some really, really bad years when catastrophes happen, and just they have to fork out a lot of money. So they've got enormous investment portfolios, especially those who also play a role in the in the pension funds and so on, or life insurance type of thing. So as investors, on the risk side, for these industries, they're really concerned about what could be called the stranded assets. So, the typical one is effectively buying an asset that will have no use in the future. So you can imagine that if you buy a coal-fired power station, you need to estimate what's its remaining life and what's happening at the end of that life, and how much you would be liable for, and whether you've got some litigation risks associated with it. So all those kind of types of questions that need to be asked where investing, but also where making the decisions to hold up to those investments. And on the positive side, on the opportunity side, it's really very much, making money with the money we have. So where are we going to invest our money? So in the next, I guess, where's the next technology development what is the next technology development that is going to actually take off? Obviously, if you invested in Tesla about 15 years ago, you'd be a very rich man, or a very rich company by now. So identifying where the opportunities are for industries or specific companies within industries to carve out market share, to carve out a new business, to carve out the new innovations, and expand is obviously quite critical. But that's not the only role that an insurance is playing. As an insurer, they're also risk managers, and they realized a while ago that they need to help their clients, because their clients pay premiums, that the premium, there's a real upside in managing risks for your clients, because if the risks do not occur for your client, then you're saving yourself money when things go wrong and so on. So helping their clients even for free, and in the building sector that is happening a little bit, like sharing information on the risks that may be facing some of the buildings or the assets that their clients are owning, is a way, for a clever way, and a win-win type of way for insurers to make money by not losing money. So that's also very, very critical for them, and that plays out both in the physical side of things and the transition side of things. And I guess as an underwriter, disruptions also mean lots of opportunities for new products. So basically, when you actually underwrite, that means basically insurer. When you underwrite risks, and the risks are increasing for company or shifting, then tailoring your product to actually respond to a market need. I'm thinking potentially in the agricultural space. What sort of products do the growers of grains or other commodities need to be able to carry out their activities in a way that will ensure that they'll still be here in business for the foreseeable future. And as the landscape is changing literally in those industries, then the needs of their customers evolve, and it's really important to figure out what disruption might occur, so that they can actually tailor new products and be ahead of the market, and be successful as simply as a business, carving market share out of their competitors. So I hope that makes sense. I think I'll leave it there, Monique, and I think Jack will have also a case study to share. Is that right?
So I think Jack shared his at the end of his presentation around the marine sector. So I think that actually this would be a perfect time for us to transition into a little bit of Q&A before we wrap up at 1:30. And despite having a huge number of people on the call today, I think everyone's just been absorbing information and perhaps still processing it. So I am going to kick off the questions, but I would encourage everybody to type questions that are coming to mind for you into the chat so that we can participate. So Jack, I might be, I'm not trying to be political, but I wonder if the XRB, I know you're in the middle of a process with quite a lot to go in terms of developing guidance for the first tranche of reporters, but do you have a sense of what the next steps for mandatory disclosure might be beyond the tranche of businesses captured in the most recent amendment to the Act? What do you think? What's your crystal ball say?
You're thinking mainly in terms of more entities potentially coming into scope?
Yeah, is that something that we could reasonably expect when we're thinking about what engineers need to get up to speed on?
Yeah, I mean, so I was involved obviously at central government when we consulted initially on the whole idea of mandatory reporting disclosure standards. And, you know, the response was pretty overwhelmingly positive to the idea. I think everyone was quite surprised by I think Minister Shaw describes it as, you know, business asking for regulations. It's always a little bit surprising, and the stuff's pretty technical. So, you know, there was a desire to see this because it really gives a somewhat of a level playing field, and it ensures, you know, there's a lot of concern in the voluntary space if you do really good risk and opportunity assessment, and some of it can be negative, that you're the only one in your sector coming out and sort of poking your head above the parapet. So, you know, the whole mandatory regime sort of puts everyone on a level playing field. But the feedback we also got at the same time was, well, the way it's cut, you know, is to get at the, you know, and this is consistent with the way TCFD started, was, you know, those with investors effectively, you know, so it's quickly into you have to be NZX listed and you have to be a large financial institution to be in. And, you know, that leaves a lot in terms of New Zealand's overall climate risk, in terms of privately held companies and those other public sector institutions that fall out of scope. So there was a lot of, you know, desire at that point, and this is talking back, you know, over 18 months or something ago now, for the regime to be expanded. And yeah, as I said earlier, Cabinet has agreed that it will consult at some point on the expansion of it. So in terms, you know, that is in the pipeline, and it's just a question as to when exactly the government will do that, and when and who they will sort of propose, I guess, in terms of that expansion, because it can be quite cut all sorts of different ways. But I think that that's certainly the direction of travel. And I guess I would say, even if you know, if you're an entity that's not in scope, or you're not involved with that crowd, you know, I think quickly TCFD is forcing all of the sectors to get involved with this, so that, you know, for example, telecommunications and IT, even though there's only one or two reporting entities captured by the regime who are listed companies, quickly, you know, there's now, from the banks, investors' point of view, they're now looking at that from a sort of sectoral lens, climate risk and opportunity lens. You know, they will be looking at that sector themselves, because, you know, they will be exposed to that. And so they increasingly are going to have to either come up with their own point of view on how these sectors look in terms of exposure, or they'll be asking for information from these sectors in terms of, tell us what work you've done and, you know, how exposed you are. So, you know, this is going to trickle all throughout the whole economy. And I think, you know, regardless really of what sector you're involved with, you know, it's going to impact in some way, in some form over time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really true, Jack. And I know today we've, because of the nature of disclosures, we've talked about entities a lot, but I think it's really important to remember that the process in order to disclose is the thing that changes the business model. And as that business model is changing, then the requirements of the entity change, which means even if you're, say, part of a project team being, you know, brought into a business to do one specific thing, the expectations of that client will have changed because of this work. Christoph, I want to, well, actually, both of you might have perspectives on this, but Christoph, I'm particularly thinking of your work with the insurance company, where you've highlighted the opportunities that they found by going through the process that you described. And we said at the start that despite the urgency for action, there are opportunities with a climate response too. How do you support entities or businesses undergoing this process kind of getting into that opportunity space?
Well, scenarios are quite useful for that. So we always say we actually need to have the right people in the room to start with. So, you know, people who have got a real mandate to change things. So it's important to do a good stakeholder mapping when we start supporting people who typically come as consultants. We don't, you know who the movers and shakers are. So it's quite important to have that kind of authorizing kind of environment, making sure that, you know, the boss is on board. And then when, as Jack was saying, if you put your head above the parapet, then you're not going to be shut down. So there's that kind of like creating the right environment, making sure that I mean the best workshop I've ever had was like when everyone was scared about the CEO, thinking that it was rubbish, and within 5 minutes into the workshop, the CEO was like, had got it, and he was like, encouraging everyone to go ahead and just being really super creative and so on, and it worked extremely well as that for that reason. So you need to have people who have got the kind of the authority, but also the technical knowledge to actually develop think creatively about the business model. Then you have to develop good scenarios that are actually meaningful to the company that is being effectively going through the process. So we typically try and have as many interviews as we can with people to really understand what's relevant to them, to understand what indicators of success they have in their company already, to see how that might shift when you overlay kind of like the future scenarios. And we do the research based on that kind of like, well, this is the areas that are really important today. And then you look at both sides of what could challenge that those effectively pillars of success, but also by looking a little bit laterally into areas that might not be within their realm on their radar right now. I mean, a very, very typical one or usual one could be if you are a fossil fuel distribution company like BP, would you look into solar? Well, at some stage you had to make that shift. Yeah, and the answer is well, certainly should, because that's what's going to be left when you're no longer distributing petrol. And I guess the last point is like the experts, like the value of the experts. We saw that, like, and I'm not talking about me at all. They're talking about people we've got who were not seen as consultants or not seen as having necessarily something to sell, but one of the supermarket chains I was working with, the board got into their head that they needed to be informed of that, and thankfully, because they did need to be informed about the business aspects, but they wanted to go back all the way back to climate. So what's the weather? Why is the weather changing and so on? So we needed to get the Bureau of Meteorology to come and talk to them. It was not super relevant, but that's what they wanted, and they wanted to go back to first principle and start understanding why is this actually changing and so on first. And that's the important thing, to just giving space for people to have to be on their own journey. And just go back 3 steps if you need to go back 3 steps, provided you bring everyone on board. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thanks, Christoph. I see a question here from Jerry, who's asked if we have an example for the energy sector, and I guess there would be some very interesting results or comments from the energy deep dive, potentially, Christoph. I guess I think of things really simply, that as we electrify everything, demand increases, and then physical, particularly in New Zealand, that physical risk, i.e. changing rainfall patterns, has the potential to change our electricity supply. And that's the nexus of transition at the absolute highest level. But I mean, Jack, I'm sure you've been thinking about this from a XRB perspective. Did you have any comments on an energy example, or Christoph? I'm happy for one or both of you to answer the question.
Yeah. So we have been looking at it at the moment. So we, effectively have plans to reach out, talk to the sector. We know that there are various organisations like, so the Aotearoa Circle that facilitated the marine work. They're talking to the energy sector leaders around doing that soon. So there's definitely conversations going on. And then globally, in terms of examples, I know of the, I can put the link in the chat, but there's been some really good stuff that's happened in the electricity sector in Australia, which they have a great website with all sorts of sectoral, more risk assessment type climate work that they've done. But that's a good example of, sectoral collaboration. And I think it's probably been more in that, get that base data and information sort of in play. And then the WBCSD, is also a good source of examples. I believe they have energy ones, and they have done this, development of guidance and sectoral collaboration around TCFD and various pilots. So I can put the link in the chat to that one. I'll just quickly find the energy page. You know about
thanks.
that? Do you know about that one, the electricity sector one, Christoph, in Australia?
Yes, it's and the WBCSD is really good. They also have on construction and so on. So electricity, electricity. The energy sector is fascinating, and obviously, I think TCFD is asking, like, this idea of value chain is really also forcing you to go back and consider that as a system. And some companies, like I did some work for a distribution company, which is both, is interesting at various levels. It's both distribution, transmission, and distribution of gas. And because they are not generation at all, they was like, not me. Like, I just do a little bit on my losses, but I'm just taking something from A to B, And I then have to equate that to saying, okay, so let's look at another example. Armament, would you be happy to transport a missile from A to B and say, not my business, like, I'm not responsible for that. I don't need to consider the risks of having a nuclear head on one of my trucks. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we need to reconsider a little bit our thinking there. But importantly for them, it becomes the kind of there's a transition aspect, an enormous transition aspect in terms of gas. Is there a future for gas? What do I do with my assets? Is my assets still valuable? And what are the indicators of, like, the gas shifting to, well, my assets still valuable because I can distribute green hydrogen, for example, or no, it is a stranded asset. Gas is coming out of fashion. Is it a transition fuel? Is it not transition fuel? What are the economics of and all that? So absolutely fascinating on that part of the business and how they balance, this part of the business and the others. Then on the distribution and transmission sector, well, in Australia, we've got the renewable energy zones that are effectively, the big question is we need centralized generation still with electricity for electricity from wind and from solar, both. And with there's plenty of space, so that's not a problem. But they are still the best areas are quite far away from the production center, are still quite far away from the utilization center. So there's business to be had there in constructing transmission line, and that's contrary to the previous business model. These are competitive. They're not just basically paid to maintain a network. The new networks are actually what they call contestable. So all these implications are really important to them. Not to mention then the last one. I'll be very brief on that. But the fact that the grid needs to massively change to be able to accommodate. And I'm talking about distribution now, no longer transmission, but to accommodate the dual flows from the decentralized generation. So, naively at the start, I was thinking, okay, if you put some energy back in the grid through rooftop solar PVs, it's not really a problem. It's going to get used somewhere. The distribution network is really made of lots of nodes, and the nodes are not necessarily equipped to actually push the power back uphill or centrally. So there are also fascinating issues there.
So many issues. We could do Q&A much longer. I am conscious of time though, and I do want to just allow Jack to clarify the role of the XRB in providing advice to the government. That's in response to your question, Joanna, a bit earlier that I apologise I missed. As Jack provides that final comment, we're going to pop a couple of polls up to take your pulse, since you're a bit quiet in our session. We're keen to understand where you think your risks and impact lie. So please do respond to the polls, and Jack, I'll hand over to you to respond to Joanna's question.
Great. Yes, thanks, Monique. So yeah, the question, I'll just read it out. Oh no, that's disappeared on me. I think it was effectively what's, have we been advising government on transition risks associated with policies and, you know, climate risks associated with policies? I would say no. So our focus is effectively to develop this standard, which is in the first instance pointing directly at those entities I put up on the screen in terms of the financial institutions and the large listed corporates. But, you know, I am aware with my previous hat on that there's no shortage of work going on in that space in terms of effectively integrating these kinds of considerations into policy choices and government processes. You know, there can be there's the various questions around how broad you go, because, you know, the TCFD process and the framework's very broad, and it's trying to get at probably sort of an annual type of a cycle in terms of effectively reflecting on your whole strategy and your business model, and then deciding whether you need to make changes at that level. You know, whereas some of the government and some of, you know, I can imagine for engineering type contexts, it's project level, much more, you know, frequent decisions that need to be made. So sort of going really broad on risks and opportunities can be tricky. And so I think that there's always that question about, right sizing, that's always lurking around. So yeah, our focus is on those guys. But thanks for the question. Off to the poll. It looks very interesting.
Thanks for clarifying, Jack. And yeah, I'm glad that you see both the risk and opportunity of what we've been discussing today. That it does my heart good that we've helped open up this dialogue with you. However, we are just a little over time, so for now, we will bid you ka kite. All of the webinars, including this one, will be available on Engineering New Zealand's new climate action portal that was launched just 3 weeks ago. So please do go and check out any webinars you missed or that you want to share with colleagues, as well as the various materials that we're populating onto that portal over time. Including actually the various resources that our presenters have leveraged and noted over the course of the series. Thank you for all of your participation, and particularly thank you to my colleagues Jack and Christoph for taking time out of their very busy days to share their expertise and insights. You can find them both on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with TSS if you've got any further questions. And from a branch perspective, we certainly intend for this to be the beginning of our collective work on climate change through Engineering New Zealand, not the end. But for now, the end of this webinar, the end of the series, and we wish you a really safe and happy holiday season. Wear a mask, wash your hands, ka kite.